Arkansas transfer forward Maryam Dauda has officially committed to the Gamecocks, and her addition is going to benefit one particular young star on South Carolina's women's basketball team.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I'm Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and also the lead publisher for Gamecock Digest over on Fan Nation. Thank y'all so much for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or watch for your team here today. We are free and available both on YouTube and wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. Happy Wednesday, Gamecock Nation. Hope that you've all had a great day so far. Staley and South Carolina's women's basketball program has certainly had a great day as they've officially landed Arkansas transfer forward Maryam Dauda, who committed to the Gamecocks not long before I was actually set to start recording this show. But we've already talked a good amount about Maryam Dauda's game. We've talked about the fact that Dauda obviously shoots the ball well for a front court player behind the three-point line. We'll talk about that more in a couple moments. And she's also going to be a rim protector for this team. She was third in the SEC in total blocks this past season behind just Kamilla Cardoso and Ashlyn Watkins. But the main thing I want to talk about on today's show is not her skill set, but more so how her skill set is going to help another young player on this team showcase her full skill set even more this upcoming season. And that player I am talking about is MiLaysia Fulwiley. Now, to get into this conversation, want to go back to Dauda's three-point shooting percentage from last season real quick. Again, 31.9% on 91 shots. And I was a bit surprised because when I talked about Maryam Dauda yesterday and I mentioned this percentage, some people actually went to the comments section on YouTube and said that that was a bad shooting percentage. Just to keep in mind for a second, she is a forward. She's not a wing player. She's not a guard. She is a front court player. Okay? If you go and look at the NCAA's stat logs from this past season and look at the best three-point shooters in the country by percentage, Dauda was the 13th best forward nationally in terms of three-point shooting percentage. Only 12 forwards, and sometimes that included, in my opinion, smaller wing players, 5'10", 5'11", only 12 players were listed ahead of her. Okay? So just keep that in mind when you say 31.9% is a bad shooting percentage. If you applied that to, say, Raven Johnson or Tahina Paopao or MiLaysia Fulwiley, fine, understandable. You would have a pretty solid argument there because they play the guard spot and you're expected to be good three-point shooters if you play at the guard position. But with Dauda, it's a little bit different. Dauda is not going to always play with her back to the basket, at least the majority of the time, more than likely, like you've seen with Aaliyah Boston and Kamilla Cardoso over the past 4 or 5 years as a South Carolina Gamecock fan. So, how could Maryam Dauda be utilized in South Carolina's offense this next season? Well, obviously, I'm not in the meeting rooms. I'm not in the mind of Dawn Staley, so I don't know exactly how they're going to use her, but I am going to give y'all my best guess here. They're going to lean into her strengths, and one of her strengths, clearly, based on the numbers compared to others at her position, is three-point shooting. South Carolina this past season became one of the better three-point shooting teams in the entire country after having several seasons where they didn't have very many shooters on this team, really outside of one or two players that could do well from the perimeter. So, with Maryam Dauda, how could she be utilized? Well, for one, she could be utilized on some fade screens. And if you're a basketball aficionado, feel free to correct me if I get the definition wrong here, but on fade screens, I believe that when that takes place, the screener essentially stays behind the three-point line instead of running to the basket like you would on a regular pick and roll. So for fade screens, Maryam Dauda could set a screen for a particular player at the perimeter, and then instead of running alongside them, essentially, basically just take a few steps backward and sit behind the three-point line, and if she's left all alone, she's got a wide open three-point shot. That's one way she could be utilized. Another way she could be utilized is through slip screens. I know this one. With slip screens, it's basically the exact opposite as a fade screen. Instead of trying to lag behind, you're trying to get ahead. So you're going to set up a screen like it's a regular pick and roll, but right at the last second before the screen can actually be initiated, if you're Maryam Dauda in this case, you take off running to the rim. You hope the paint area is open and you're going to have a chance to get an easy bucket or potentially draw a foul and get to the free throw line. Obviously, they're polar opposites in terms of just conventional, traditional screens, so I could definitely see Maryam Dauda being used in that way on this team next season. So why do I bring all of this up? Well, I bring all this up because of MiLaysia Fulwiley. MiLaysia Fulwiley, she is going to have a chance, if she's playing alongside Maryam Dauda a good amount this next season, to showcase everything that she has in her bag. She's going to have a chance to showcase her court vision, her passing ability, her acrobatic ball handling ability, the explosiveness that she possesses, her athleticism to a much higher degree. It's not just the fact that Fulwiley is going to have an extra year of experience now under her belt at the college level before this upcoming year. It's not just the fact that Dauda is a solid three-point shooter, but the whole point of all of this is spacing. With Kamilla Cardoso and Aaliyah Boston, obviously, you're not trying to overcomplicate things. You're just going to tell them, hey, go on the low block, try to seal off your defender or whatever you want to do. We're going to throw you the ball, go make something happen. And obviously, if you're South Carolina with how often it worked doing it that way, you're not going to stray away from that. But the Gamecocks are not going to have a player on their team next year where they're going to be able to just do that all the time. And plus, for someone like MiLaysia Fulwiley, who clearly thrives when she can just hit the gas pedal and go straight to the bucket, having someone like Kamilla Cardoso pretty much camped out, sometimes in the lane, sometimes right where the bucket is at, that makes things more difficult for someone like MiLaysia Fulwiley. And so, having Dauda going away from the basket, stretching out to the perimeter, doing all these different screen actions in conjunction with MiLaysia Fulwiley, that is going to open the door for her to do a lot more things on her own this next season. And heck, even if someone does run over from, say, the corner to try to give some help defense if they're caught napping on a screen action, Fulwiley can then just throw it to the corner, maybe to a Bree Hall or a Tessa Johnson, and they can sink a wide open three. You see where I'm going with all this? Maryam Dauda, I get it. She's not going to necessarily be a dominant post player like Kamilla Cardoso was this past season, or Aaliyah Boston was for the multiple seasons before Kamilla took over that spot. But she is still going to be very impactful for this team on the offensive end. And again, as I've mentioned now multiple times, she will also make an impact on the defensive end with the length she possesses at 6'4", and she has proven she can be one of the better shot blockers in the SEC. She has experience in this conference. Quite frankly, I really don't see any downsides adding Maryam Dauda to this roster. So, South Carolina, look, I'm not going to say that Maryam Dauda is just going to be given that starting spot. Dawn Staley obviously wants to promote competition in her program. I'm sure she's going to do the same thing here. But bringing in a Maryam Dauda, that tells me that in all likelihood, if we had to just take a guess right now, she'll probably be the starting five, or at least in the starting lineup for South Carolina when they play their first game in Las Vegas against Michigan later on in the fall. Now, going from women's basketball to South Carolina football, Shane Beamer and his team, obviously, they have to have decent results on the field this upcoming season. And there's also been a lot of talk about how said results could affect Shane Beamer's job security, something we haven't really talked about yet on this show. So What exactly does Shane Beamer need to do in order to remain safe after this year? And what kind of result could lead to Shane Beamer needing a vote of confidence from athletic director Ray Tanner? We'll discuss all those different scenarios in just a few moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel's giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. The Minnesota Timberwolves narrowly avoided being swept by the Dallas Mavericks on Tuesday night, winning Game 4 105-100, making it 3-1 Dallas. But obviously, the odds makers still feel like that the Timberwolves, they're climbing up a steep hill right now, as they have got them listed at plus 450 to win the entire series as a whole. With Anthony Edwards and Karl Anthony Towns on that team, along with the Rudy Gobert, I don't think that you should count out the Timberwolves just yet. So, if you think Minnesota can pull off the improbable, then that plus 450 might be a good number to put some money on. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Welcome back to this Wednesday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. And as always, a big thank you to each and every one of you everydayers who make the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen wherever you get your audio podcasts daily, or your first watch on YouTube. All right, let's talk about Shane Beamer's job security. How would it change depending on what the football team does here in 2024? Well, I think that we can all definitely agree that Shane Beamer, he needs to avoid having a second straight down year. What would another down year look like? In my opinion, it would basically be winning 5 games or less. However, I did join Locked On SEC a few weeks ago and chat with Chris Gordy about South Carolina's football team. And at the end, we talked a little bit about what Shane Beamer has to do. And Chris Gordy brought up a really good point. He mentioned how it's not just the final results that matter, but more so how you get to those results. What he meant by that was basically this. Are you being competitive in these games, or are you getting just blown out, run off the field, run out of the stadium, however you want to term it? So, here's the first scenario. Let's say South Carolina wins 5 games or less in 2024, and they lose the majority of their games in blowout fashion. If that happens, I think in that situation, Shane Beamer would need a vote of confidence from athletic director Ray Tanner. I think that in this scenario, South Carolina would likely win games still against Old Dominion, Akron, Wofford, and Vanderbilt. But in this scenario, they win a couple of those games by just 2 scores or less. So let's say they go to Vanderbilt and they only win by 7 or 10 points. South Carolina fans would view that as a massive disappointment, considering the fact that South Carolina has not lost to Vanderbilt since 2008. Maybe in week 1 against Old Dominion, the Gamecocks go out there and only win by 2 scores. Matter of fact, the FanDuel has set the opening spread for that game around 14 points, give or take. So if you go out there and do that, that's already going to be one major red flag for the fan base and the administration. In this scenario, South Carolina probably doesn't win any road games outside of potentially Vanderbilt. We talked about this before as well. Shane Beamer, to this point in his tenure at South Carolina, he is 3-11 overall on the road. When you narrow it down to just SEC competition, he is 2-10 in SEC road games. You want to take out Vanderbilt in that equation, he's 1-9 in SEC road games. So yeah, not a very good resume in terms of being a head coach on the road. So in that scenario, that likely does not change. And also, against some of the most talented teams on your schedule, teams like an LSU, Ole Miss, Alabama, Oklahoma, got to throw Missouri in there right now based on what they did last season, and then Clemson, you don't even look like you belong. You're not even close in any of those games. If that happens, Shane Beamer is basically going to need a statement to be made by Ray Tanner and the administration where they say, we still feel like that Shane Beamer can turn things around with this football program. Now, let's say, once again, South Carolina wins only 5 games or even less than that, but this time they remain competitive in a lot of these games instead of getting blown out. In my opinion, if that were to happen, Shane Beamer would be back in the 2025 season, but he would automatically be on the hot seat. So in this scenario, South Carolina, say, loses by 10 points or less to teams like LSU, Ole Miss, Oklahoma, and Texas A&M. Games where there could be a potential path to winning each of those games. But for South Carolina, the odds are not going to be viewed as being in their favor. And then they turn around, they defeat maybe one of Kentucky, Missouri, or Clemson. They get at least a staple win, if you want to call it that, in the 2024 season. Something where they can say, okay, when the team is playing well, this is what the final results could be from the beginning to the end of the season. Either way, Shane Beamer, he would not be feeling comfortable heading into the 2024 offseason if the team only wins 5 games or even less than 5 games. But what would the situation be for Shane Beamer if, say, the Gamecocks win 6 games and make it back to the postseason? Or if they even go above that and they win, say, 7 or 8 games? We'll talk about what the ramifications would be of that in a few moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your team every single day in just 30 minutes. All right, let's continue our conversation about Shane Beamer and what the final results of the 2024 season could mean in terms of his future job security. Now, we just went over the worst case scenarios in terms of winning 5 games or less and then getting blown out in the majority of your losses or being competitive in the majority of your losses. Now, let's talk about the good side of things. Let's talk about if South Carolina wins 6 games or more. Let's start out with just winning 6 games, meaning you're making it back to the postseason. You're going bowling once again. If that were to happen, no matter how you won or lost all these games, the seat would cool a little bit, in my opinion. And Shane Beamer, in turn, would get a 1-year contract extension. Right now, Beamer's contract currently runs through 2027. And the rule of thumb for a lot of ADs, for a lot of administrations, when it comes to college athletics, especially with football, is this. If your coach is still doing well enough to where they've kept their job, and they get to less than 4 years remaining on their contract, you want to make sure that they at least get back to 4 years. That's always usually been for recruiting purposes, because if Beamer were to do this and not get any kind of extension, then other coaches around the league and, teams, geographically speaking, like Clemson, North Carolina, they would sit there and use that negatively against the Gamecocks, saying that, hey, they're saying that things are all going so swimmingly over there, but Shane Beamer did not get anything added to his contract recently. He's got 3 years left. We all typically get 4 years or more. He doesn't have that right now. And I know what you're sitting there and thinking about. The kid's not going to care at all about that. They don't care about contracts in terms of what the coach is making. I get all that. But guess what? Guardians care. The parents care, or uncle, grandmother, grandfather, whoever is in that situation, whoever's sitting there in that room, they hear something like that through the life experiences that they have had, the wisdom that they've gained, they're going to raise their eyebrows a little bit at that. So that is more important than fans may realize. So if South Carolina were to win exactly 6 regular season games, I do think that Shane Beamer would just get a 1-year extension to his current contract. Not a raise, but a 1-year extension. Now, how do they get to 6 wins? In my opinion, they win the gimmies, which again, Old Dominion, Akron, Wofford, and Vanderbilt. Those are the 4 gimmies, in my opinion, on the schedule. And then they would win 2 of the following games. At Kentucky versus LSU versus Texas A&M. Could definitely see that with South Carolina. Obviously not going to make a season prediction right now. But if they were to get to 6 wins, in my opinion, that's the most likely path to them doing so. Now, let's go all the way to the potential ceiling for this upcoming season. what if South Carolina surprises even a lot of Gamecock fans, and they turn around and they win 7 or 8 games in 2024? Obviously, if something like this were to happen, probably a couple things would have to take place. Lenore Sellers obviously would have to probably be one of the best young freshman quarterbacks to have ever stepped foot on the field for South Carolina and in the SEC for that entire season. And the defense would have to probably play out of their minds, especially up in the defensive front along the interior and at the linebacker position. But again, I'll save all that for another day. If South Carolina were to win 7 games or more in the regular season, the hype train would be back in the station officially. And Shane Beamer, he wouldn't just get a 1-year contract extension. He would get a 2-year contract extension, which would give him 5 years remaining after the conclusion of the 2024 season. So once again, if you're going to get to 7 or even 8 wins, South Carolina's going to win 4 gimmies. They're going to win against Old Dominion, Akron, Wofford, and Vanderbilt. We get all that at this point. And they would also take 3 or more games against the following teams, in my opinion: at Kentucky versus LSU versus Ole Miss versus Texas A&M, at Clemson. Again, you could convince me one way or another that South Carolina could win any of these games. As we have seen from the Gamecocks in years past, you could also convince me they could lose all of those games. It just depends on how the team comes together, how the coaching staff comes together, especially on the offensive side of the ball with all the changes that have been made coaching-wise for the 2024 season. But in my opinion, that is what would have to happen for Shane Beamer to sort of regain some of the good grace that he has had with the fan base, or at least had built up prior to the 2023 season actually taking place. With that being said, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. Hope that y'all thoroughly enjoyed today's show as always. What are your thoughts on Dawn Staley and South Carolina's women's basketball program adding Maryam Dauda to their roster? How do you think it could help MiLaysia Fulwiley take another massive step in her game this upcoming season? And lastly, what do you think the 2024 season could do in terms of impact on Shane Beamer's job security? Do you think he could be fired if they win 5 games or less and they get blown out? What do you think could happen if they win 7 or 8 games? No matter what your thoughts are, let me know in the comments section if you watch this show on YouTube, or you can shoot a direct message at @aline_SC if you listen to today's show on an audio podcast app. As always, thank y'all so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Wednesday, and I'll be sure to catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.